Good afternoon. I call this hearing to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for this official remote hearing. I want to make sure to note some important requirements. Let me begin by saying that standing House and committee rules and practice will continue to apply during remote hearings. All members are reminded that they are expected to adhere to these standing rules, including the quorum. With that said, during the cover period as designated by the Speaker, the committee will operate in accordance with H.R. 965 and the subsequent guidance from the Rules Committee in a manner that respects the rights of all members to participate. House regulations require members to be visible throughout a video connection during the proceedings, so please keep your cameras on. Also, if you have to participate in another proceeding, please exit this one and log back in later. In the event a member encounters technical issues that prevent them from being recognized for their questioning, I will move to the next available member of the same party, and I will recognize that member at the next appropriate time slot, provided they have returned to the proceeding. Should a member's time be interrupted by technical issues, I will recognize that member at the next appropriate spot for the remainder of their time once their issues have been resolved. In the event a witness loses connectivity during testimony or questioning, I will preserve their time. The staff addresses the technical issue. I may need to recess the proceedings to provide time for the witness to reconnect. And finally, remember to remain muted until you are recognized to minimize background noise. In accordance with the rules established on the H.R. 965, staff have been advised to mute participants only in the event there is inadvertent background noise. Should a member wish to be recognized, they must unmute themselves and seek recognition at the appropriate time. Thank you. Since February, the outbreak of COVID-19 has taken a significant toll on the entire U.S. economy. This crisis has hit America's small businesses especially hard. 3 out of 4 small businesses have been experiencing a decrease in revenue since March, and an estimated 7.5 million small businesses are at risk of permanent closure as a result of this crisis. As members of this committee and as legislators at the federal level, we have a responsibility to secure funds to help America's small businesses survive this crisis. So far, Congress has allocated over $669 billion in grants and loans through the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, also known as EIDL, and a new EIDL Emergency Grant Program. From the onset, Congress intended for the PPP and EIDL programs to provide immediate relief for small businesses to withstand the initial economic shock caused by this pandemic. But as we approach August, we cannot ignore the reality that the COVID-19 pandemic has morphed into a much more devastating and extensive crisis than even some experts anticipated. And the rhetoric coming from this administration downplaying the seriousness of COVID-19 undoubtedly led many states to rush to reopen, ultimately exasperating the problem. So we must be prepared with long-term solutions that will meet the magnitude of this crisis as we push forward to heal as a nation and find better days ahead. We can start by examining the policies adopted during and in the aftermath of the Great Recession as a model moving forward. While we must recognize the inherent differences in these two devastating events for our nation, we must also remember that back in 2008, the outlook for small businesses was similarly uncertain. In response to the Great Recession, Congress stepped in and passed a series of bills that provided $1.2 billion for small businesses through the SBA lending programs. This critical step unlocked tens of billions of dollars in guaranteed loans to small businesses that could not otherwise access capital when traditional credit markets froze. Policies enacted then proved to be a critical lifeline for thousands of small businesses in danger of closing their doors. At the same time, the Obama administration focused on how small businesses could help contribute to America's recovery by accelerating entrepreneurship and unlocking capital for the nation's smallest and youngest businesses. This money was well spent, as small businesses were some of the largest contributors to job growth in the recovery, especially minority-owned and women-owned businesses, who alone were responsible for the addition of 1.8 million jobs from 2007 to 2012. The nation's investment in entrepreneurship paid off, as the United States saw more than 550,000 new businesses open since 2011, and the economy continued to grow. Because of the economic contributions from small employers and independent contractors after the Great Recession, it is imperative for this committee to explore those proposals and how we can modify them for the COVID-19 era. I also welcome any discussion of any new ideas brought to the table by members to address the challenges our small businesses are facing today. Whether it is utilizing traditional SBA programs or instituting innovative ideas, long-term recovery requires us to think out of the box, but also come together in a bipartisan fashion to provide relief to small employers. As Congress works to explore additional ways to help America reopen and recover, I hope we continue to prioritize the smallest of small businesses, minority-owned and women-owned businesses, the ones that helped rebuild our nation the last time we found ourselves knee-deep in what felt like an insurmountable crisis. Again, I want to thank the panelists for joining us here today, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Shaba, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today. On this committee, we know how important small businesses and startups and entrepreneurs are to the economy. However, one of the consequences of this global pandemic is that our main streets are in very real danger of long-lasting damage, or in the worst case, permanent closure. Some have warned we could be in only the beginning of the worst wave of small business bankruptcies and closures since the Great Depression. We must be proactive and effective in our attempts to not only sustain, but recover and expand the influence of America's small businesses and main streets all over the country. Recent research from universities such as Harvard, the University of Chicago, the University of Illinois, and others have found that some small businesses, especially micro enterprises, may be the most susceptible to permanent closure. We must work together and listen to those like our witnesses here today who know and appreciate that critical segment of our economy. As communities reopen, we hope to find solutions that lead to fewer headlines indicating small businesses are closing and focus more on the recovery on which we are about to embark. I look forward to the testimony of all our witnesses here today and to our continued partnership on this committee. And I thank the chairwoman for again working with me and for our side of the aisle in making this, I think, the most bipartisan committee in Congress, and that's why we're so effective in, for example, putting together the PPP program and trying to reform the EIDL loan program and so many other things. So I want to thank the chairwoman for her continued cooperation and yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and it's a pleasure. And it has been an example of how we need to do the job on behalf of the American people. Now, I would like to take a moment to explain how this hearing will proceed. Each witness will have 5 minutes to provide a statement, and each committee member will have 5 minutes for questions. Please ensure that your mic is on when you begin speaking and that you return to mute when finished. With that, I would like to thank our witnesses for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. Our first witness is Mr. Brett Fullmer, the president of the Small Investor Alliance. In this role, he works to foster a healthy environment for small businesses investing and a strong and profitable lower middle market. Mr. Fullmer served in the executive branch from 2002 through 2005 as a presidential appointee in the Commerce Department, as Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Legislation. He holds a history degree from Davidson College. Our second witness is Ms. Amanda Cohen. Ms. Cohen is a James Beard nominated chef and owner of Dirt Candy, the award-winning vegetarian restaurant in New York City's Lower East Side in my district. The restaurant was the first vegetable-focused restaurant in the city and is a pioneer of the vegetable forward movement and is included on the list of the 10 restaurants that changed America. She received 2 stars from the New York Times and was recognized by the Michelin Guide 5 years in a row. Welcome. Our third witness is Dr. Lisa Cook. Dr. Cook is a professor of economics at the Michigan State University. Prior to joining the faculty at Michigan State, she was a senior economist at the President's Council for Economic Advisors from 2011 through 2012. She also held positions at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Federal Reserve Banks of Minneapolis, New York, Philadelphia, the World Bank, the Brookings Institution, and the Hoover Institution. Welcome, Ms. Cook. And now I would like to turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Chabot, to introduce our last witness.
Thank you very much again, Madam Chair. And our final witness is a fellow Cincinnatian, Pete Blackshaw. Mr. Blackshaw is CEO of Centrifuge, a startup incubator created by Procter & Gamble, or P&G, as a lot of people refer to it, or Kroger and Western Southern and other major entities in our greater Cincinnati community. He previously served as global head of digital marketing and social media at Nestle's global headquarters in Switzerland. He recently served as chairman of the board of the National Council of Better Business Bureaus and is now chairing a recently chartered supply chain and new commerce restart committee. Pete is a graduate of Harvard Business School and the University of California, Santa Cruz. I recently had the pleasure of meeting with Pete via an online platform with the Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce, and he was truly impressed with, or I was truly impressed with his forward-thinking ideas on the recovery. I hope he was impressed too on the call, but I know he will provide valuable insight to the committee, and I look forward to hearing all the witnesses here today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chabot, and thank you all for being here today. I now like to begin by recognizing Mr. Fullmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for giving me, thank you to the committee for giving me the chance to share SBIA's view on how the small business investment companies can accelerate the recovery and create jobs for the long term. My name is Brett Palmer, and I'm president of the Small Business Investor Alliance, the trade association representing small business investors, including SBICs. SBICs are SBA-regulated venture capital and private equity funds that provide long-term capital into American small businesses. For many, but not all, our economy was doing well prior to the pandemic and the ensuing government-mandated shutdowns. The economic disruption has exposed, amplified, and intensified pre-existing problems faced by the nation's small businesses. It has also created new ones. These amplifications affect vast numbers of small businesses, but the pain is not evenly spread by geography, industry sector, stage of business, or even race. It's also important to remember that the job losses and business injury we have experienced are only first-order effects of the pandemic. There's more coming, but we just don't know what. We have faced hardship before. We know what good public policy can do to help bring the economy back faster and stronger and to benefit more Americans. Now is the time to improve existing government programs to make sure they provide maximum benefit to as many Americans as possible. So policy adjustments should be made to address the immediate needs of small business in a way that takes into account past deficiencies and also meets future needs. Instead of normal stimulus spending where the benefit is temporary, Congress now has the chance to focus on the long term and to empower and amplify the private sector that provides outsized job creation and sustainable benefits to communities by fully utilizing the SBIC program. Our economic problems are intense, will be long-lasting, but access to patient capital is the core to many of the solutions to the challenges we face. So improving the SBIC program should address some of these problems that previously existed, challenging accessing patient capital, which is particularly acute in low-income areas, both rural and urban, and even more acute for equity capital. The massive concentration of venture capital and growth capital in only a couple areas of the country, leaving the rest of us behind. Large disparities in accessing startup and growth equity, underinvestment in domestic manufacturing and domestic production, underrepresentation by women and minorities in both funds and in small businesses accessing capital. And there are too few small funds which provide smaller investments and that would fit in smaller communities and less dense communities. There are a host of new problems as well. Massive unemployment, failure of many small businesses, and some estimates are that 22% of small businesses are now out of business, with a catastrophic failure of minority-owned small businesses, with some estimates of 32% of Hispanic-owned businesses and up to 41% of Black-owned businesses lost. That's a national catastrophe. The American entrepreneurial spirit is strong, but to reemerge and recover, the small businesses will need to access patient capital. And patient capital is equity capital. It is long-term debt and equity-like debt, which is capital that can sustain the ups and downs and the fits and starts in any economy, even the pandemic. We also need to remove unintentional barriers to minorities and women forming SBIC funds. And more SBIC funds need to be formed that are smaller and serving more parts of the country, because smaller funds really are able to handle smaller markets and serve smaller businesses. So the SBA's framework is a good one, but this experience is a very different experience from the last recession and needs a tailored response to meet both the old needs that were unfulfilled and the new needs. So modifying the existing programs is faster and affordable and more effective than a lot of other things we could be doing. So SBA proposes a couple changes to the existing program, not creating new programs, just modifying them. We would ask Congress to authorize an on-ramp to forming more first-time SBICs. A micro SBIC license would remove unintentional barriers to minorities and women entering the program while providing needed smaller dollar investments across the country. The SBIC program should also be modified to enable SBICs to provide more the most patient, the most impactful, and the most job-creating capital, equity. When the Library of Congress looked at the SBIC program, they found that equity investments by small business investment companies commonly created over 400 or sometimes over 500 new jobs per investment, and we need those jobs. There are also existing SBIC tools that provide patient equity-like capital, but they are currently limited by geography. These geographic restrictions should be lifted and made available to all small businesses. An SBA should encourage and enable SBICs to look for opportunities to make investments in underserved communities, both rural and urban, by making additional leverage available for investments in LMI areas and in underserved communities. And finally, it would be very helpful if SBA's Office of Investment and Innovation could be fully staffed and have the technology they need to be fully effective. They've been held back for that for years, and I think there's an opportunity for us to do more, and that would be a long-term investment that would provide long-term benefits. I'd also like to thank the committee for having an oversight hearing on the SBIC program last fall. It was probably an oversight committee, the likes of which I know I've never seen before in 25 years, but it was very helpful. And under Administrator Carranza's leadership, it has been transformative and positive, and she's brought in Chris Weaver to the program, and it's really turned around and doing great. So thank you for your oversight. Thank you for this hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fullmer. And now I would like to recognize Ms. Cohen. And please let me remind members, you need to keep your cameras on. Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Velasquez, ranking member Shabbat, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you so much for inviting me to testify today about my experience with the Paycheck Protection Program, the experience of other independent restaurants, and what this industry needs to survive the rest of the year and beyond. My name is Amanda Cohen, and I am the chef and owner of Dirt Candy on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Chairwoman Velasquez has been a longtime advocate for business owners like me, and I'm honored to appear today as a voice for so many voiceless businesses. Dirt Candy is a fine dining vegetarian restaurant in New York with about 40 seats in a bar. We started back in 2008 with just 18 seats, but quickly outgrew our first location, and in 2015 we moved to this new one on the Lower East Side. I am also honored to represent the leadership team of the Independent Restaurant Coalition, a newly formed coalition of thousands of chefs and restaurateurs across the country in every congressional district, organized for the first time in response to the pandemic. We represent America's nearly 500,000 restaurants, nearly 3/4 of all dining establishments in the country, who don't have the same access to significant debt instruments or private equity as corporate-owned businesses. Today, I'm going to share the story of independent restaurants, how we use the PPP, and what we need to do to survive, which is really your help. Dirt Candy reopened a week ago today for outside seating, the first time since New York's shutdown orders. Outdoor dining has forced us to dramatically alter our menu and processes for serving customers. A number of our dishes are really not conducive to heat, the rain, wind, and our seating is on a ramp to the Williamsburg Bridge, which really isn't the most romantic location. I wasn't able to pay my employees during the shutdown, so many went on to unemployment or took other jobs. Well, I received a Paycheck Protection Program loan. I chose not to use the money at the start because it was unclear when we could reopen again. And if my fixed costs of running a business don't change and demand for dining out remains low, there is absolutely no way Dirt Candy can survive. Because there's a larger issue. Going out to a restaurant is not considered to be safe. When the pandemic hit, I laid off all 35 employees at Dirt Candy. About 6 weeks ago, I rehired one person to help get the restaurant ready to reopen in its current form. As of today, I have only rehired 17%, or 6 of my employees, and I don't plan on rehiring others for the foreseeable future. This was only possible because of the PPP. In fact, the changes to the effective date of the PPP that this committee worked on and which went into effect in June are the only reason I could afford to reopen Dirt Candy at all. But even if my doors are open, there are still 29 more people who used to count on Dirt Candy for their well-being who are out of work. Some independent restaurants could not access the PPP because their bank took care of other customers first or rejected their applications. Others were afraid to use the loans they received and return them because they could not afford to make a mistake and take on more debt. Those who received and used the PPP loans are seeing them run out or not bridge the time needed to fund operations in this uniquely affected industry. The one thing that would be enormously impactful for the restaurant industry is passing Congressman Earl Blumenthal's Restaurant Act. The chairwoman has co-sponsored this bill, for which I am exceptionally grateful, as have 8 more members of this committee. Independent restaurants generate $271 billion in direct and indirect economic activity. Passing this bill would reduce the unemployment rate by 2.4%. As many as 85% independent restaurants say they will close without direct help. Passing this bill would help avoid this disaster. Restaurants need your help. As you can see from my testimony above, the PPP, with the significant changes Congress made in late spring, is an 8-week solution to an 18-month problem for restaurants. My PPP loan allowed me to reopen, but it is not going to allow me to stay open, even if it is forgiven. And Dirt Candy does not stand alone in this. Our restaurant supports farmers, vintners, brewers, liquor purveyors, and an entire supply chain. Most other restaurants can add fishers, ranchers, and other parts of the supply chain to this list. And imagine planning a trip to New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Charleston, Atlanta, or Washington, D.C. without being able to visit the great restaurants that they're known for. Independent restaurants draw millions of tourists from all around the world. In 2019, total spending by domestic and international travelers on food services in the United States was $279 billion. That's more than double the amount spent on either recreation or retail. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and to share the story of independent restaurants with you. I sincerely hope that you'll find a way to help independent restaurants with all the hard work you're doing on behalf of small businesses across the country.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. And now I would like to recognize Dr. Cook for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Velasquez and Ranking Member Shabbat, thank you for the opportunity to address the Committee on Small Business on the topic of long-lasting solutions for a small business recovery. The coronavirus pandemic and the resulting human, economic, and financial crises are unfolding at breakneck speed. And as a result, small firms are in crisis. The quick action of Congress has gone some way to lessen or postpone the pain associated with this pandemic-induced recession. Specifically, assistance to small businesses to keep paying employees through the $670 billion Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, the largest ever investment in small businesses, was a critical lifeline for many small businesses. Prior to the pandemic, most small firms reported being in good shape, and 73% reported that their financial health was good or stable. Nonetheless, the financial health of small firms varied greatly depending on the race or ethnicity of the owner. Compared to 27% of small white firms reporting that they were at risk or in distress, 49% of small Hispanic firms and 57% of small Black firms reported being at risk or distress. Black and Hispanic firms were less prepared to weather an adverse shock like this pandemic. According to the Federal Reserve, distressed firms are 3 times more likely to close relative to healthy firms due to a 2-month revenue shock. Further, the concentration of small minority-owned firms in certain sectors makes them more vulnerable in the wake of COVID-19. These sectors in which many small minority-owned firms are overrepresented are accommodation and food services, personal and laundry services, and retail. By early May, it is estimated that 100,000 small businesses, or 2% of small businesses, had already closed. By mid-June, of the businesses that are listed on Yelp, 140,000 of those closing since March 1 were still closed by mid-June. 35% of shopping and retail businesses listed have closed their doors temporarily. 53% of restaurants listed have closed their doors permanently. The burden of small business closures is also unevenly distributed. 41% of African American businesses reported being closed, compared to 35% overall. In the only survey providing demographic data on PPP loan recipients, the Color of Change reports that 45% of Black and Latino businesses will close by the end of the year without more relief. Minority-owned businesses also report not being able to access PPP loans due to the heavy reliance on large banks, with whom they have had historically poor relationships. Over a third of small businesses reported paying reduced rent or deferred rent payments. In 538's most recent survey, the majority of macroeconomists believe that there will be a partial rebound in economic activity and a slow recovery, rather than a V-shaped sharp recovery. With a slower than anticipated recovery and with the experience of PPP, I would urge this committee to consider what it might do in the short and long run to address the small business crisis. Now, I would support policy action that would modify PPP to work alongside the enhanced unemployment insurance benefits under the CARES Act. The Rebuilding Main Street Act from Senators Van Hollen, Merkley, and Murphy proposes such a modification. This would provide grants to especially hard-hit small firms to cover fixed costs and expenses. If the employers use short-term compensation arrangements or a system such that the employers avoid layoffs and instead reduce hours worked by each employee at the firm. Employees would then continue to receive unemployment insurance on a prorated basis to compensate for reduced wages. No matter what the modification, demographic data should be collected at the loan or grant application phase in any future modified PPP effort, not just on the back end of the program. These data were supposed to be tracked such that the most vulnerable firms would be prioritized. Not only should these data be collected, any current and additional relief should be targeted at these firms. Policymakers should consider, in the long run, distribution channels for aid in the future that could provide aid to small firms directly rather than via banks or other lenders. Most importantly, the human and technological capacity of the SBA to process and implement swiftly and efficiently such a program as the PPP should be increased significantly. Given the longstanding importance of small businesses as an entry point to the middle class and their contribution to the economy overall, this capacity building should have happened long ago. And this won't be the last natural disaster or economic and financial crisis, and SBA will need to be better equipped to meet these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. And now let's recognize Mr. Blackshaw for 5 minutes. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Velasquez, Minority Ranking Member Chabot, members. Thanks for the opportunity. I just have one core message, and that is that the best way to help small business owners thrive in this very uncertain world is to help them think and act like startups. And when I say startups, I don't mean Silicon Valley or Ivy League entrepreneurs. I'm referring to the next generation taking on big, unsolved challenges in every sector of our society and turning them on their heads. And many of the startup founders are women and minorities, a growing percentage, I say with pride, are coming from the Midwest. And we're living in an age of unending disruption in which economic, social, health-related shocks are going to become more common. Some call this VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And a VUCA world requires VUCA leadership, precisely what a startup mindset enables. And to be clear, there are urgent needs, as we've heard, today, that small business owners need help right now. Paycheck protection, access to capital, streamlined regulation and policies, all critical and necessary. But we also need to look beyond the present to a future that is going to be even more demanding than the moment that we're living in today, and to do so with urgency. Now, many of us talk about reskilling or even upskilling. Neither, in my view, is enough. We need startup skilling. And a startup mindset prizes speed, rapid prototyping, constant iteration, failing fast to learn fast. It's obsessed with data, what to see in it, and how to exploit it. It's very, very digital. I think startup skilling should be a national priority, led perhaps by the SBA and involving corporations, universities, and startup ecosystems. Now, what does startup skilling look like? First, it's showing small business owners how they can apply startup thinking, technologies, and practices to their own ventures. So, for example, at Centrifuge, we hosted a program called Nitro in partnership with JP Morgan Chase. Over one weekend, we startup skilled several dozen minority-led businesses. We gave them access to mentors. We showed them how to leverage technologies. We brought in Google. We taught them the principles of startup leadership. And I think this is something that we should be doing constantly, every weekend, in fact. We're also seeing a promising movement in what's known as micro-credentialing, aimed at urban and rural areas. So Miami University of Ohio, for example, is one such school that is kind of taking their faculty outside of the ivory tower, bringing them into the community with different types of credentialing, focus on new business skills, basic skills in finance, marketing, accounting. I think we need a lot more of that. We need to encourage the universities to do that. Second, I think it's about learning from the digital natives, the kids who've grown up digital. As we speak, Centrifuge is sponsoring a virtual summer entrepreneurial academy. It's way oversubscribed. And these students, high schoolers in college, they're developing startup ideas to help address pressing challenges related to COVID, sustainability, social justice. And we're challenging them to explore ways in which radically more transparent supply chains might be part of a better future. Thirdly, I want you to think about mobilizing and re-platforming small business services. Don't shoot the messenger, but I spent hours before this testimony, reviewing government and SBA digital apps and websites and you name it. I think the SBA in particular needs a digital startup infusion. And I would encourage you to think about why can't government create an open innovation platform to crowdsource easier, less bureaucratic online solutions for small businesses. It's not just about money, it's about time and simplicity. Or why not take greater advantage of audience-rich big tech, Google, Microsoft, Amazon? I mean, Facebook, for example, has more than 3 billion users, including tens of millions of small business users. And I know they're taking lots of heat for issues I'm not going to get into here, but why not invite them to co-develop a next generation hub for small business services and startup skilling, not a page or an ad campaign, but SBA on steroids. That would be a game changer overnight. My final observation is that I think there's little distinction between a tech startup and a mom and pop small business. They're both based on an idea, a problem that needs to be solved, an entrepreneurial spirit, and the desire to take a shot and carve out your own path. And whether we're talking about scalable technology or small town service, we're talking about the same thing. Businesses built on the ingenuity, passion, and persistence of people who simply want to make the country better by finding a better way. That's American entrepreneurialism. And I'd say the bumper sticker is, let's startup skill America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blackshaw. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Cook, Congress responded to the Great Recession by making a couple of changes to SBA loan programs, including increasing the guarantee on 7A loans and reducing fees in both the 7A and 504. As Congress waived long-term recovery proposals for small businesses, would you recommend similar changes to SBA lending programs right now going forward?
I would, because this has to be encouraged. Take up has to be encouraged. But I would also echo what Mr. Blackshaw was saying, that the digital transformation of SBA is something that I was promoting when I was at the White House in 2011, 2012. I think this is absolutely, given the speed of this crisis, I think this has got to be matched with the speed of digital infrastructure and human capacity building at SBA. Yes.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that we need to keep in mind, especially the administration, when they submit the budget, because it takes resources in order for them to implement those changes. Ms. Cohen, as the virus continues to spread in our country, we have seen states who had once reopened restaurants and bars now shut them down again. How have the multiple closures impacted the hospitality industry?
Madam Chairwoman, multiple closures are devastating for restaurants. We lose staff, we lose food, we lose our customers' goodwill, we lose our hope. A second round of full closures will finish off a number of independent restaurants permanently.
Thank you. Thank you. And there has been call for proposals targeted to certain sectors that may face a long road to recovery or who may face reoccurring shutdowns like the hospitality industry. Why do SBA's current economic relief programs not address the hospitality industry needs? And why is targeted relief necessary?
The hospitality industry has unique issues. We depend on gathering a lot of people in a small place to generate revenue. So long as people are not in my restaurant, I will not be able to pay suppliers, continue to employ my staff, or generate revenue. I cannot take on any more debt with any of these other programs. I need something that specifically we need something that specifically works for the restaurant industry that allows us to get back up on our feet without any debt. Some of the programs have worked.
Thank you. Thank you. Just we have a short period of time to ask all the questions that we need to ask. Mr. Fullmer, the congressional efforts that we have seen so far to provide relief for small businesses have focused on bank financing, specifically the PPP program. So as our local economies begin to slowly reopen and recover, can you walk us through what some small businesses will need in terms of long-term capital and the role that the Small Business Administration or SBIC program can play for providing that capital?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I think Amanda, the other witness, nailed it pretty well. A lot of businesses are up to their eyeballs in debt, and they're really going to be looking for patient capital. They're going to need something that isn't going to cause the banks that are already in forbearance and not calling on their loans to provide capital. And they're going to need either equity or they're going to need equity-like capital. And there's some tools that exist in the SBIC platform, particularly the LMI debenture, that are very patient, where you can draw a loan, but there's no payments for 5 years, and then you pay after that. And that operates at zero subsidy. That's a proven tool right now, but it's limited in geography. So a lot of places can't use it. Opening up some tools like that, I think, would be very helpful in the recovery of businesses. And as you add more SBICs, being able to offer those, I think it'd be even more beneficial.
Thank you. My time has expired. And now I will recognize the ranking member, Mr. Chabot.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll begin with Mr. Fullmer. Mr. Fullmer, you've testified before our committee many times. We appreciate you being here again today. How important is it that we evaluate current government programs to reduce duplication in order to ensure that our programs are the most effective that they can be?
I think it's critical. And I think right now Congress has the time to really focus. And when the CARES Act was created, the PPP was a lifesaver, and it's a brilliant program, and thank you for doing it. But certainly there were some problems with it because it was written at the front end of an economic tornado hitting. Now you have the time to really look at it and make sure things are effective, not duplicative, and that they're really adjusting to the different industry sectors and geographies that need different types of capital. So I think it's necessary.
Thank you. And I'll get Mr. Shaw next. How can the Nitro program that you mentioned serve as an example for future efforts? And was there anything that you felt could have been improved, or any recommendations that you would make to us?
Thank you for the question. My first regret is that we treated it as episodically. We had one weekend that we built up, but looking back, we can do that nonstop. And I want everyone here to think about it. Just think about this hearing right now. It's, their ability to kind of scale services and scale intimacy in the form of any type of training has gone up exponentially. And so it's really easy to parachute in an expert who can help a small business owner to pick up a critical skill. And there are very critical foundational price of entry digital capabilities that even the ice cream shop needs to understand to be competitive in the marketplace today. So I think the opportunity is how do we scale it? I think there's a big opportunity to get more companies to subsidize the effort. This isn't just about getting the government to kind of pay for it. I think there's a win-win for everyone, but we got to bring that startup mindset of more for less, digital kind of agility. And then definitely leverage this power of virtual, not to take away from the offline. There's still a power there, but we can serve a lot of critical needs really, really fast.
Thank you very much. And I think I'll go to Ms. Cohen next. Ms. Cohen, in your testimony, you discussed how people still feel unsafe going to restaurants. The same can be said for the tourism industry as well. What can we do to help people to feel a sense of safety and security again, so that your restaurant and others will be moving in the right direction?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure we can get anybody to feel safe until we have a vaccine. That is the reality. In the meantime, not forcing restaurants to have to open up more tables than they feel comfortable with, or hotels or anybody. We cannot congregate too many people in one place. We have to make people feel safe. It is my job as a restaurateur to make my customers feel safe and to know that I have made my employees feel safe so everybody can come and dine and feel relaxed, which is what they should do in a restaurant. But I can't do that if I'm looking at my bottom line instead of my payroll.
Thank you. Dr. Cook, you had said that you felt that we were likely to experience, a slow recovery. If you had to pick just one thing to change that, what would it be?
I would echo the sentiments of Mandy Cohen that there has to be attention paid to COVID-19 first. That's absolutely it. There's nothing else. If I have to choose one thing, it would be that we would provide, say, relief to businesses, to the American people that had to do with addressing the healthcare crisis.
Thank you. And I think I've got time to squeeze one more question in. So, Mr. Blackshaw, I'll go back to you again. We're obviously both in the Midwest here, and you mentioned the Midwest. What specifically is encouraging startups in our part of the country in the Midwest, at least prior to the COVID crisis, and how can we continue to fuel that startup culture that we've been seeing?
I think it's critical to lower barriers of entry for entrepreneurs, and cost structure contributes to that. I don't know. I'm a native Californian, so I don't want to disparage my former state, but there's a cost structure that can get in the way of being able to kind of jump in early, test and learn. And I do think I located my first startup in Cincinnati. The burn rate extended much longer. I think there's a quality of life that typically gets overlooked. And there's a wonderful synergy, especially in greater Cincinnati, but also northern Kentucky, with the large companies that are very, very open in a very humble way from let's work with startups because they can solve big challenges that we can't figure out. Maybe we're too bureaucratic and there's a healthy internal focus that I am seeing more in the Midwest than I've seen in other locations. And so I think those are just a few of the factors that really play out. I think wherever you are, building a supportive ecosystem is critical, and that's public, that's private, universities. Those formulas can work.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Fullmer, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair. Yeah, let me just unmute and thank you very much. Madam Chair, I want to thank you. I want to thank the ranking member, obviously, for convening this particular hearing. I think it's an extremely forward-looking topic that has to be dealt with after, and I agree, we've been able to deal with the major topic, which is this pandemic. Madam Chair, I apologize for just getting on recently. As you know, the Democratic caucus is underway, and I am on the hearing of the Oversight Committee. So I jumped on to be on. It's been an interesting discussion. I would reserve any time or the right to ask questions at this moment so that I'm not deliberately or undeliberately redundant in what I would like to talk about. And I would yield back and welcome the discussion that continues.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes. Is Mr. Hearn on? Okay. Mr. Stover, the gentleman from Minnesota, is recognized for 5 minutes. You need to unmute. I think that he is having technical difficulties.
I am, Madam Chair. Can I get back in a minute?
Sure. So
I just want to.
Mr. Burchett is recognized for 5 minutes.
All right. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate the testimony and appreciate Chair Lady and Ranking Member. I was Dr. Cook answered this question for me, but I would like to know from Mr. Palmer, in your testimony, you mentioned that up to 22% of the small businesses will fail due to the COVID-19, but that number rises to an estimated 41% of Black-owned small businesses. That's a huge disparity, and that troubles me greatly. Since my whole life, I've worked in and around our community and business community and lots of Black folks, and I'm concerned about that. How do you think we can address or rectify the problem?
It's a real problem. And once we sort of get the economy stabilized with health, which is, again, the foundational issue, and I'll just set that aside, I think we really need to look at, really equity capital. There was an excellent article by Eddie Brown in the Washington Post this last week, the founder of Brown Capital, and he called equity capital the rocket fuel for job creation, and he highlighted how little of it is in the hands of Black entrepreneurs. I think we need to form more SBIC funds that have more Black fund managers and more women fund managers. And that's part of that SBIC, that micro SBIC model, where we can form funds by broadening out the funnel of who can come in, and then we can harness the private investment that comes in and amplify it in a way that really creates jobs and ownership of businesses. But we have to be deliberate about the real barriers, because the most Black entrepreneurs just have less capital. The amount of startup capital that a Black entrepreneur has versus a white entrepreneur is about 1/36th, and that's a barrier. And so they need external capital. We need more small private venture funds and more small private capital funds around the country, and not just concentrated in the 3 areas where they spend most of it now. So I think getting more of those that are regional or local would be a very beneficial help.
And what I've found a lot of the times here is that in Tennessee, the funds are available, but dadgummit, nobody knows how to get to them. And, I guess you got the good old boy network, but also it's just a method of educating folks, and whether that through the Urban League or Chambers of Commerce or what have you. I see a huge duplication, and I don't see anything getting done. I just see the people in these organizations driving nice cars and having nice offices, and I'm not seeing anything done.
I think that there's been some studies done that a lot of Black entrepreneurs don't get loans, and part of it because they don't ask for them, because they think they're going to be turned down. They don't have that connection in the community or in that region. And I think that the financial providers, both SBIC funds and banks and others, need to do a far better job of doing outreach and letting folks know how to access the capital, because it is there in many cases.
Yeah. What do you think the nonprofits in the private sector can do to increase access to capital and promote recovery?
I think the private sector is the driver for it. Nonprofits, there are lots of different nonprofits that can be facilitators and educators and provide roles. And Mr. Blackshaw, as a witness, is an example of that, as far as training those entrepreneurs about how to access that capital, how to ask for the right kinds of capital, the right amounts, how to be prepared for it to increase your likelihood of success. But ultimately, we need tax policy and regulatory policy that really encourages and augments and doesn't create barriers to accessing that capital. So we need both working together in a deliberate fashion.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Cohen, I dig your enthusiasm. Never been to New York before. You can probably tell from my accent. I'm not even from the north part of Tennessee. But I was wondering about the ripple effect that'll occur in our communities with the restaurant industry operating below full employment, and what can we do to limit these effects and make our economy recover faster, ma'am?
Well, first off, you were invited to my restaurant anytime that you're in New York.
Now, did you say, is it a vegetarian restaurant?
It's a vegetarian restaurant. It's a vegetable restaurant, but it's delicious.
Okay, if you say so.
So the best thing you can do is actually support our restaurant act. That will put more money back into my restaurant, and then I can put it back out into the economy, and I can start supporting my suppliers again. That's what I really need to do. I need to help get them back up on their feet. And the only way I can do that is if I have some money to spend on them.
How much time do I have left here, lady? Have I run over?
Almost. 2 seconds.
Do what?
2 seconds.
Okay, well, I'll yield back the remainder of my time then. Thank you so much. And I'm once again, I'm glad that my wife is not here to see you, because if she saw that wonderful outfit you're wearing, I knew on the way home I'd have to be looking for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and you're always so hospitable to me. Thank you, ma'am.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now the gentle lady from California, Miss Chu, is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Palmer, I'm so glad that you are here to express how important SBIC is and how much more potential it has to address our COVID-19 economic crisis. Since its inception, SBICs have created or sustained nearly 10 million jobs. And yet this program operates at extremely low risk to the taxpayer. Even though there is an SBA guarantee, the private investor's capital has to be completely exhausted before that guarantee is even impacted. And as a result, this program operates at zero subsidy. So because of this success, I introduced HR 116, the Investing in Main Street Act, to allow banks to invest more of their capital in SBICs. And the legislation passed the House early this Congress, but still awaits further action in the Senate. So can you explain what made the SBIC program so successful during the last economic recovery, and how the Investing in Main Street Act can make SBICs more effective as our economy recovers from the COVID pandemic?
Well, thank you very much for that question and for your support of SBICs and making that correction that would allow more banks to put capital into SBICs. And I'll mention that there are a couple of reasons why the program works. First, it works because it passes all the private sector requirements. And second, it works because it fills a public policy purpose. The program really puts the taxpayer in second loss position and the private capital in first loss position, as it always should be. And I think that makes it work. I really think right now, one of the things that's coming out of, we have the pandemic, but we also have massive social unrest and an awakening to some problems that existed before. We need more smaller SBIC funds, and I think we need more smaller funds serving minority communities. And you have the banks that are very interested in doing that now. And so we want to take away any barriers that would be in place that might limit the ability for capital providers to get capital where it is clearly needed and recreate those jobs that have been lost and restart up those businesses that may be mothballed at the moment and re-empower those entrepreneurs. So that's what we do. We'd like to do more of it, and then your legislation is a critical part of it. So thank you very much for your support of it.
Thank you so much. Dr. Cook, people of color have suffered disproportionate health and economic impacts during the COVID-19 pandemic. As you mentioned, business owners of color are at higher risk of permanent closure, which makes SBA's failure to collect adequate demographic data on participants in recovery programs like the Paycheck Protection Program especially harmful. For example, SBA failed to collect any racial demographic data for 94% of the nearly 500,000 PPP loans under 150,000 that were made in California. That means they only collected on 6% of the businesses that actually got those loans. Well, given California's diverse population, that's unacceptable. One thing I know, these businesses need help. So I plan to introduce legislation to authorize SBA's Community Advantage Loan Program, which provides access to affordable government-backed capital to underserved markets. And under this legislation, businesses owned by minorities, women, and veterans, and also provide some technical assistance. Can you talk about the role of the programs that programs designed to reach underserved small businesses should play in our long-term recovery?
Well, one of the key features of entrepreneurship in America is that it has been a path to the middle class, and it's been a path to wealth. And certainly for minority businesses, given the losses they suffered, minorities suffered, especially Blacks and Hispanics suffered during the Great Recession, this would go some way to close the racial wealth gap. So I think entrepreneurship is just so critical to the American experience, to both income and wealth. The kind of attention that would be given to it, I think, would be well worth it.
And why is the demographic so important?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. Why is the demographic
information so important to have?
Oh, it's because, as I mentioned in my delivered remarks, the Black and Hispanic businesses especially were already vulnerable. So if you want to really make sure that you're making sure that the recovery is even, they should be targeted. And this was, I mean, you all articulated that they should be prioritized, and for good reason. So I think there's any extension, any additional relief going to small businesses should make sure to target these businesses and collect the data, the demographic data.
The gentlelady's time has expired. And now we recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stover.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Velasquez and Ranking Member Shabbat. Mr. Blackshaw, how do you think we most effectively bring the, quote, startup skill you mentioned in your testimony to rural America?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, clearly, well, I mean, the first thing I think we need to continue to take a close look at internet broadband access in rural districts. And I think anything we can do to kind of equalize access, I think is really important. I think in the state of Ohio, there's a big concerted effort on that. And I think that's good for any type of kind of startup layer. There's no question that digitalization pervades everything. And so I think getting that piece work is is absolutely critical. I think one of the great things about what we're all experimenting with right now is I think if that digital infrastructure is in place, there's infinite access to, training, experts parachuted in, virtual mentoring, you name it. And I just challenge us to think about like how we can use that new environment, what we're doing right now on steroids into a completely different model of access, even in rural communities where I think, what the one opportunity in certain rural districts is you kind of get to invent everything from scratch. You're not burdened by a lot of legacy practices in terms of how technology is used. You basically, put in a whole new fat broadband pipe and you're kind of inventing almost as a startup would with a clean sheet of paper. So I'm very bullish about the opportunity there, but there's clearly, some investment on technology required and obviously probably some funding as well.
Yeah, one of the biggest issues that has been exposed during this pandemic is limited access to broadband in rural America. It has been talked about for many years, but many are seeing just how bad it is for the very first time. So when we come to these hearings and hear the many wonderful ideas of how we can help businesses pivot their models and help them mobilize and re-platform, it feels that the businesses in rural America are not considered. And I think it's high time that we actually take that step forward and start investing. We need to take steps to bring parity to these rural businesses so they can be more resilient and as you mentioned, Mr. Blacksaw, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. It's critically important. And I would just say, from your words, Mr. Blackshaw, let's definitely work together to bring that startup skill to rural America. We are seeing the digital divide, the negative effects of the digital divide. We have school children in rural America that their parents have to drive them to a bus that is a hot spot so they can download their homework and get their homework. That is unacceptable. And we also know that rural America, this broadband is going to help keep our rural school children competitive, our rural hospitals open, and it's going to bring the rural economy. People are going to move to rural America for our quality of life. And I think we have to, it is time now to invest in rural America and the broadband to bring those startup skills to everyone, including not only rural Minnesota, but rural America. And would you agree with that?
Not only that, I'm signed up to help in any way. I think it's critically important. It's overdue. And the opportunity and the upside, the payout will be massive if we make that effort.
Yep, that's an investment that needs to happen. And Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans. You need to mute, Mr. Evans.
That's fine. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Cohen, many of my constituents in Philadelphia are restaurant owners like yourself and are barely surviving. Coming from a city where nearly half of the population are minorities, I'm interested in solutions that can help many groups as possible. That is why I support the Restaurant Act. Minorities make up over 40% of the overall restaurant workforce. Restaurants employ more minority managers than any other industry. 1 in 3 restaurant owners come from a minority background. Ms. Cohen, can you tell me why do you think the Restaurant Act would be more beneficial to restaurants than the EIDL or the PPP program?
I think that it's more beneficial to us, and thank you for the question, because both those programs put us into debt. And restaurants operate willingly on a very slim margin. We put a ton of money back into the economy. And I think it's unfair at this moment to ask us to take on more debt. So the Restaurant Act allows us to receive money without debt and put it back into the economy. And that's why it is the best program for restaurants at this moment.
Mr. Palmer and Dr. Cook, the Benjamin Franklin Technology Partners, which is an initiative of the Pennsylvania Department of Commerce and Economic Development, suggested an idea to my office on how to increase SBIC investments. The SBC investments have a low fixed interest rate, while private investors often negotiate a much higher interest rate for its portion of the investment. However, private investors must wait until the SBA has been fully repaid on this portion of the investment before they can start to receive investments. This means that private investors often wait years before seeing any return. Can you give me your reaction to that idea? Mr. Palmer or Dr. Cook?
Oh, sure. I don't know the full details, but I think that I'm actually working with the Benjamin Franklin Partners to use the SBIC program more broadly, make it more accessible to small venture funds like theirs across the country. The private investors that drive these things do demand a certain rate of return, and we need to make sure that whatever products we're offering actually passes the market filter there to drive that private capital to them, to make sure that the capital is there. Because if it's not, they just won't do it. But I don't know the specific structure, but I'd be happy to work with you and your staff on it, because I think Benjamin Franklin funds and serve Pennsylvania well, and I think they're a model for lots of other states. And we'd love to make the SBIC program more flexible to serve more funds like that in more places in Pennsylvania.
Dr. Cook, any reaction?
I would say that anything that pushes private investors to invest in African American entrepreneurs in particular is well worth it. Only 1% of African American founders receive venture capital funding. So anything that will increase that kind of private capital, I think, would be well worth it.
Okay, Mr. Palmer and Dr. Cook, real quick. 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York, saw over 70% of all venture capital investment from 2014 to 2018. In that same period, my home state of Pennsylvania received less than 5% of the total venture capital. What suggestions would you have that we could do in Pennsylvania to make it more appealing?
I would suggest that not just for Pennsylvania, but to the diversification and democratization of venture capital is reimagine an equity platform for the SBICs. When the SBICs were able to do more early stage investing, they were all over the country in much smaller cities and outside those three concentrated areas. We can do that in a way that is protective of the taxpayer and that would fix a lot of that problem. I think that's one of the things that the SBA can do and that you have authority on this committee over.
Dr. Cook, real quick, you have any thoughts on that?
I would say that one of the things that would attract capital to areas like yours, like mine in Michigan, like Blackshaw's in Ohio, would be to invest in digital infrastructure. I hate to keep going back to this. I work on the economics of innovation, but the digital divide between rural and urban, for example, or from the coast and other places in the country, it's critical that this be built out. We're not going to be competitive at any kind of competitive economy if we don't do this. So I think this is a deep investment that has to be made and be made quickly.
The
gentleman's time has expired. Now we recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Velasquez and Ranking Member Shabbat. Thank you for the hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for lending their expertise. I appreciate the interesting discussion about some new and long-term solutions, some of them potentially expensive, but I hope to address briefly one beneficial policy change we can make right away to an existing program so more small businesses remain standing once this crisis is over. 2 weeks ago, our committee heard from SBA Associate Administrator James Rivera on the implementation of the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program in the course of the pandemic. To be frank, I believe SBA's rationale for limiting the size of idle loans to $150,000 to have left a great deal to be desired. This decision not only sorely disappointed the expectations of businesses hoping to receive relief, it was an incomprehensibly bad credit decision. After all, if a business's intrinsic financial circumstances warrant a $2 million loan, to extend it a $150,000 loan is a futile act, which guarantees not only failure of the business, but of course a default on the inadequate loan as well. And that in turn negatively impacts U.S. taxpayers. Unfortunately, it is up to Congress to fix SBA's error. When reflecting upon our hearing and talking to constituents, one idea suggested was to allow idle borrowers to go back for a second idle or modify the EIDL loan balance to receive a higher amount. The idea would be if a business received an idle for less than the appropriate amount, it could receive a supplemental loan for the difference between the appropriate amount according to SBA underwriting standards and the amount previously loaned under SBA's misguided $150,000 limitation. For example, if Company X would have qualified for an EIDL for $1 million to help it weather this crisis, but only received $150,000, Congress would allow that business to reapply for a second EIDL worth up to $850,000. To restore constituents' faith in our relief efforts and those of SBA, it is important, I submit, that we provide them the relief that was promised to them on the front end. To the panel, Mr. Palmer, we've had good conversations. You've always supported and been open about common sense solutions. Do you think this idea of allowing businesses effectively to double dip on EIDL would help more businesses to weather the short-term storm?
I'm not sure I'd call it double dipping because the statutory language, I think, was a $2 million cap. I mean, I think there's an obligation for agencies to follow the explicit language of the law written by the legislative branch.
That's correct.
One thing, I think it's just the right thing to do legally. We're a nation of laws. But two, there's clear expectations from small businesses. If small businesses were dedicating their limited time and resources to accessing amount that the law specifically allowed and didn't know they could access, but they really couldn't access it, that's not really fair to them. And this disaster has gone on longer than expected. So I think allowing people to go back to get the caps that they need, knowing the damages that they have, seems perfectly reasonable to me.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. And I agree. I think my choice of term is probably a poor one. It really is simply going back and allowing them to have what was intended in the first instance. Dr. Cook, would you agree with Mr. Palmer's assessment of that idea?
Yes, I would.
Ms. Cohen, I heard what you said about the restaurant legislation that would provide grants, and I'm sure that would be your preference. But do you know of any additional restaurants that could take advantage of the ability to go back and get the full EIDL amount or something closer to it, depending on its own circumstances? That would be a welcome opportunity for some.
I can't speak for all restaurants, but I certainly know that no restaurant I know is at the moment can possibly sort of fathom the idea of taking on more debt while we're still trying to climb out of the situation that we're in, unfortunately.
Do you think if they had a choice between additional indebtedness that would allow them operating capital to continue or not receiving any benefit, they would like to have that opportunity?
That's a tough choice.
Yeah.
A little bit of a Sophie's choice there. I'm not sure. I mean, yes, I think most restaurateurs would like to stay open, but I also know that it seems like impossible to work with this unbelievable debt hanging over your head at a time
right.
It seems like we might never be able to actually open at full capacity again.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Cohen. I think ultimately that choice is debt's going to be hanging over somebody's head, over the taxpayers or over the business owners. Thank you, Madam Chairman. My time's expired, I think, or just about.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize Mr. Snyder from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for having this hearing, and obviously the witnesses for sharing your perspectives today. I know this is a difficult situation for everybody. For anyone who is going through the health crisis and has lost somebody, it's unfathomable. But it's also an economic crisis and the impact it's having on our businesses, but in particular our small businesses. As was noted earlier, I mean, I think it's somewhere upwards of 75% of all businesses have had a negative impact on their revenues, on their business. None more so, Ms. Cohen, than what you talked about in the restaurant industry, especially our local restaurants that are so much a part of the neighborhoods, the communities that we all live in, and they're struggling. And I'm happy to be a co-sponsor of the Restaurant Act because I understand how important that is. But I also will say, share the thought with Mr. Bishop and Mr. Palmer. Thank you for saying it's not double dipping. The law said that these businesses had a opportunity to get loan up to $2 million. The 150,000 decision was an arbitrary decision. I often use the analogy as if you build a bridge halfway across the river, you may feel good for a while, you're still going to get wet and not make it to the other side. We've got to provide a bridge for our economy. Our economy is made up of the businesses and the workers in those businesses. We've got to be doing everything we can to help them. And Ms. Cohen, what you were saying, I can't think of any small restaurant that's in a position to take on more debt. They're just trying to barely hang on, whether it's a takeout service, delivery service, a few are able to open, but it's going to be fits and starts. And Mr. Blackshaw, I loved your acronym VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity. You might add chaos into it right now and ambiguity. It's a tough time, and having been in business, I understand that. And we're looking forward, and I forget who said it, but the idea of an 8-month solution or 8-week solution for an 18-month problem is one of our challenges. So maybe I'll turn to the two business owners, Ms. Cohen and Mr. Blackshaw. Looking forward with this uncertainty, what can Congress do to help give some stability, some confidence, to help you make the hard choices, to risk capital, to risk your and your employees' future to try to make it to the other side?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for supporting the Restaurant Act. I am deeply grateful for that. And not to sound like a broken record, but the best thing that Congress can do is support the Restaurant Act. Let's get more members to support the Restaurant Act. That is the only way that I know and other restaurants know that we can open up safely. We don't have to put too many people in our dining room at once. We can keep our employees safe and we can keep our customers safe.
Mr. Blackshaw, you're a different type of business. What would you suggest?
Yeah, listen, I think anything Congress can do to reward, recognize, credential, innovation in this environment is critically important. And some of that is just really eyes wide open to what's already happening. I think there's a lot of the answers are out there. We just need to really smartly graft, the ideas that are taking place maybe in a lesser known area and turn it into a big national idea. I think that's what I love about the digital natives. Whether we like TikTok or Instagram or not, they're brilliant at finding sources of inspiration across the world and scaling it. And I think we have this golden opportunity to find those programs, those initiatives, those more for less ways of delivering services and turn them into big opportunities. So I think Congress can play a very, very key role shining a light on that. I think the whole issue of like reinventing your platforms is so important. It's not enough to say that the SBA site is improving 20% per year, because we've all in this VUCA world, we've gone from like a hockey stick on how we use, Zoom. And so the expectations are so much higher. And how do we bring out a clean sheet of paper on how services are delivered, how you apply for loans online? And it's all doable. We can learn. And I think a lot of these big tech players will probably gladly co-invest. I think they're looking for opportunities to show goodwill. But I think they're also genuinely concerned in the issue, and they bring know-how. And I think Congress can really make a lot of those outcomes real.
Thank you. And with just my last few seconds, thanks for that. I like the idea of the startup mentality. We need to create that startup. The challenges we face, I would describe it not just a hockey stick, it's a hockey stick on a spring bouncing on a trampoline. The rate of change is so dynamic and so fast. Government has to keep up. In fact, we need to make sure the SBA isn't just keeping up, but leading the way. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to try to do that. But again, I thank everyone. I know how hard it is. Hang in there. Keep working. Together, we're going to get through this crisis. Thanks so much. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize the gentle lady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan.
Hi, I hope that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
And I would also like to echo my appreciation to the panelists and to the committee. And I know as an entrepreneur myself, how very, very difficult it is in the best of times to be an entrepreneur. And particularly, I can't even imagine how hard it is now. And so please take my questions just as questions, because I'm trying to be as thoughtful and probative as I can be on behalf of the people that I represent. And so my first question is regarding the restaurant bill. Shortly after this call, I'll be going back and sitting with my team with the legislative lens on, trying to figure out what bills to get behind and what bills not get behind. And let me just posit this to you. To Ms. Cohen, possibly would probably be the most likely person to answer my question. Many, many, many businesses have the situation that you have right now, where you've taken the PPP loan. You may or may not be able to use it or open on time. You may or may not have to go in and out of operating your business over this period of time. I'm just west of Philadelphia, and my community just barely opened and maybe closing back again, within the foreseeable future. Businesses like live venue, live theater are just a few of those things that I could name that need just as much help as the restaurant industry does, but may not have quite as much of a lobbying power as the restaurant industry does. Why does this restaurant industry need the help different than any other company? And why wouldn't it be more appropriate, perhaps, if the PPP program has been effective, to be able to have triggered mechanisms, maybe for certain industries, maybe for certain regions or zip codes, as we come in and out of this problem? Why wouldn't we better be served by taking something that is working and tweaking it for everyone rather than one industry?
Thank you so much for the question, Congresswoman. For one, the PPP, even if it were to be extended, is still just a bridge. It's not a long-term solution for us. And the restaurant industry is uniquely and completely reliant on social gatherings to generate revenue, which is why the pandemic and public health shutdowns have affected us more than any other business. Unlike airlines or big retailers, independent restaurants do not have access to debt or capital markets. And as a result, independent restaurants face the perfect storm that will force more than 85% of them to close without intervention. That would be just disastrous for our nation's roughly 500,000 independent restaurants and the over 11 million employees that they employ.
But wouldn't you agree that something like live music or live theater or really almost anything live is in just as dire straits as your industry is?
I am not advocating against any other industry receiving money, but I do think that we have less access to capital, in particular, independent restaurants.
And in the situation where you would be able to evolve the PPP loan to be able to be as it is currently, if you use it a certain way, it is not a loan, it is a grant, and there is forgiveness. Why wouldn't we do the same and have tranches? Have multiple times, multiple dips at, as Representative, I believe it was Bishop, was talking about with EIDL, but actually genuinely in this case, PPP, multiple opportunities to access this bucket of capital. Would that not, in the case were it to be converted to a grant, would that not satisfy the restaurant industry and other industries similarly?
I cannot speak on behalf of other industries, unfortunately.
Sure.
But I think for restaurants, part of the PPP is about getting employees back on the payroll, and it's predicated on that. And that's very hard for what I'm looking at for an 18-month problem where we're going to have employees come on and off. And I don't want to on and off our payroll, and I don't want to put employees back on my payroll and then have to take them off again. I'd rather slowly build up to a time where we can actually get fully up and running.
And I appreciate that. And I really don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to noodle over kind of what our opportunities are. Do any of the other panelists with the 39 seconds I have left have anything to add or offer to that question?
I would add something is that you're right. It's not, restaurants are been taken on the chin and they are a massive employer. They're a significant local economic jobs multiplier. But there are other businesses that put together staging or lighting. They really have taken it on the chin. So your proposal on having, tailored PPP, now that we have time to be thoughtful and deliberative about how we're going to structure these things, makes some sense. And it may still do the Restaurant Act. I know nothing about the Restaurant Act, but if we can be deliberate about how we define injury, what they can use it for, what their needs are, what they make it a deductible expense, permitted expense under PPE for forgiveness, for example, to make your business safe if you're getting one of these loans. There's lots of things we can do. Or we could even, for some of these other grant programs, have it where there's no payments for the first 2 years. It's still a loan, but there's no payments for the first 2 years because the 10-year treasury right now is running at 20 basis points. You can do a significant amount for a very small amount of time, and then you take up the payments after the first 2 years to give businesses a chance to recover that are currently totally shut down. There are lots of creative ways we can look at these things, but we do have the time, but not a ton of time.
Thank you. I yield back. I appreciate it.
Sure. And the gentle lady from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, is recognized.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Cook, I just want to maybe just make a quick comment on your point related to the healthcare crisis, the public health crisis that we're in here today. My point from day one has been that if we handle the public health crisis side of this well, that the economic crisis will take care of itself. So I just wanted to say I heard you in your testimony and in your Q&A about how critical it is that even though we're on the House Committee on Small Business, that the Congress continues to focus on coming up with a more robust strategy as it relates to how we handle the healthcare crisis of COVID-19. Ms. Cohen, I also wanted to say to you that I'm a strong supporter of the Restaurants Act. I'm on Representative Blumenauer's bill. My only regret is that I didn't author the bill first. So thank you for your advocacy of that bill. I did, however, introduce a bill that the chairwoman was kind enough to also become an original on that would allow folks who have seen a 50% reduction in revenue as a result of COVID-19, as well as have 100 or fewer employees, to come back and get a second forgivable loan. Can you tell me how you think about a bill like that, which obviously is less industry specific, versus the Restaurants Act, and sort of compare and contrast the value of those two actions from the part of the Congress?
Thank you so much for sponsoring the bill, our bill. And I think that is actually a terrific bill. I think that the Restaurant Act takes care of more of our needs and that it allows us to pay back our suppliers, actually, get us back up on our feet and not just put our money, putting our money into payroll is incredibly important. And I want to get all my 35 employees back on my payroll. But I would also really, really like to be able to open my business and put money back into the economy through my suppliers.
Thank you so much for that. And I'll just a quick follow-up for you is, I know as we've reopened here in Minnesota, many of my restaurant owners, independent owners, have been asked to undertake safety measures, obviously to keep customers more safe and limit the spread of COVID-19. I'm hearing from them, even though they serve far fewer customers, that they're required to put in place higher staffing levels to open those doors. What can Congress and the SBA do to help lower those burdens at the same time ensuring that your employees and your customers remain safe?
I'm not sure what more that can be done. We have more people employed. For me personally, I have somebody who monitors the bathroom. We don't even have dine-in service, but I have guests who come in and I want to make sure that the bathroom is as clean as possible. That's not normal. I don't usually have a bathroom attendant in my 40-seat restaurant. So I'm not sure what more actually can be done unless we, get money that we can specifically use for things like the PPE or for hiring those extra people and extra cleaning, all those extra stuff.
Thank you so much. And I just really appreciate your advocacy on the part of independent restaurants. And then finally, Mr. Palmer, very quickly, do you think certain industries moving forward will face unique challenges post-COVID-19 into this recovery phase? And, any thoughts that you have on specifically what Congress can do to continue to help business recover?
Absolutely. There's going to be definitive variations, hospitality and events industries, anyone who has to do long-term planning, because right now we just don't have any idea what 2 months are going to look like, things will look like 2 months from now, much less a year from now. I think we need to be providing patient capital as much as we can. I think Congress really needs to revisit our policies as it relates to manufacturing and domestic production. One of the things that came clear out of this is that our inability to create PPP and other critical infrastructure, the fact that we still can't get Lysol disinfectant wipes in a supermarket 5 months later because we don't have the chemicals or whatever is causing those type of shortages, is kind of crazy. So I think we need to revisit our access to equity capital, to patient capital, and really make sure we're making this a hospitable place for manufacturing in the United States.
Mr. Palmer, thank you so much. I'm a founding member of the Supply Chain Caucus of the Congress, and who would have thought that would be a sexy topic? With that,
thank you for doing
Chairwoman, I yield back.
The gentle lady yields back, and I will go to Mr. Fullmer from Maryland if he has any questions.
I do. And I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for returning back to me, Madam Chair. I just have a couple of observations, which to me are significant and maybe even poignant. It was my pleasure to serve on this committee for 10 years during my first stint in the Congress before I decided I would just voluntarily leave and go do something else in life. But one of the things interesting about that is that much has changed and yet much still remains with respect to the topical areas that we are dealing with, Madam Chair. And I again, as I said earlier, this notion of lasting solutions is a key phrase because this will be over one day. The question becomes what happens to the small businesses of America. And lasting solutions are going to require ingenuity and creativity, but also access to capital and access to credit, which was the major driving force in hearings like this in 1989 and throughout the 90s, Madam Chair. When you remember the committee, it's still a driving issue. And, I think about SBICs, which we created as a Congress in 1958, and I think about all the other initiatives And I was very interested in hearing the phraseology about we need an SBA on steroids. We really do, because we really always have needed that. But there's some other things that I would think observationally that we might want to consider as we go down the road on this topic in future hearings. One of which is that, and by the way, Mr. Palmer, I appreciated your commentary and your information. I would slightly disagree with you on one matter. You said that minority businesses in many instances were not applying for some of the structured loans and other programs that are out there, whether it's SBIC or something else, because they didn't always have the knowledge. I would suggest to you that many have not applied because they know that they're going to get turned down, as they have been turned down repeatedly over and over and over again. And so my argument here is that we have to be deliberate in terms of what we do going forward, that we need a deliberate tax policy, a deliberate banking policy, a deliberate SBA policy, that we've got to find a way to create small venture capital, as someone said earlier, which is absolutely crucial. That is within the domain of the Congress itself. And we've got to look at some of the other smaller things like overly burdensome bonding requirements, the little things that create and push businesses sometimes to the edge. So I'm looking forward, Madam Chair, actually, to this discussion continuing and going on. And I appreciate your leadership and the leadership of the ranking member on this. It's something that has fascinated me for a long time. And now, after having watched this unfold for the last 31, 32 years since I first took an oath of office, it's perplexing how this issue is not only vexing, but it is repeating itself over and over and over again. So there is a lot of work to do in this area. This notion about making sure that we're taking care of urban versus rural businesses is important also. I always say urban and rural. And whether we're talking about minority-owned or women-owned businesses, there are a lot of niches here that we have the ability, I think, under your leadership in this committee to kind of cull together and put forward a kind of policy that many of our colleagues in the House would appreciate. So again, Madam Chair, thank you very, very much for your leadership. I'm going to stop filibustering as if I were on the other side of the building right now and yield back the time that I have.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your contributions and your history of fighting for fairness and especially civil rights, criminal justice reform. But how do we contribute to make an economy that is just for everyone in this country? Mr. Chabot, do you have any other question? Would you?
Not, Madam Chair. I think this has been a very interesting hearing. I think the witnesses did a great job, all of them, and learned a lot. And hopefully on a bipartisan basis, we'll put some of this into action. So thank you for holding this.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just say to all the panelists, thank you for your contributions, shedding light into what is happening and helping us put together an agenda that really reflects the unprecedented crisis that we are witnessing. And, you know, people love to say that small businesses are the backbone of America, that small businesses is the engine that fuel our economy. And this is a time that it has shown that they need help. Otherwise, a lot of them are going to close their doors forever. And Dr. Cook, I'm going to take an opportunity here in my closing remarks to ask you a question. And there are two issues that I just want to raise. And one was raised by Mr. Bishop. He is frustrated because the EIDL program provides for loans of up to $2 million. However, the administration never expected the unprecedented numbers of applications, of loans application. And rather than coming back to us to ask for an increase in the funding for the EIDL, they decided to cap it to $150,000. But we are working on bipartisan legislation that will address this issue. And Dr. Cook, right now, there is like $130 billion in the pipeline regarding the PPP. And I would like to see that 50% of that money is carved out for minority businesses and women-owned businesses. One of the issues that we are confronting is that we don't know how well the PPP is working because the data was not provided to us until last Friday at midnight. But not only that, by going through the data, we are finding a lot of errors. So how do you assess the possibility of us setting aside 50% of the $130 billion so that mission-based lenders will have an opportunity to make those loans? What impact will that have?
I think that would be critical, and I think it would be critical for several reasons. They were at the back of the line for many reasons that Ms. Cohen was outlining, but also because of these historical relationships, because of what Congressman Fullmer was talking about. These systemic issues that have not yet been addressed. But I think that, yes, setting aside 50%, I think would be extremely useful. But I think the other thing that is being missed here, I'm sorry I didn't say it earlier, is that the micro enterprises, the newest businesses, are where innovation comes from in America. And they are also being left behind. So we could have a permanent ding on economic growth if we're not attending to those that don't yet have relationships with banks. So I think for minorities, for the smallest businesses, I think we really have to do more, and they should be grant-based. There can't be this uncertainty that Ms. Cohen is talking about, because they don't have the capacity to figure all this stuff out, and we shouldn't put that burden on them.
Right, and micro lenders provide capacity building for those businesses. So we fought to get them as part of the mission-based lender in the second tranche of money that we passed. Well, let me again thanks all the witnesses for your participation. I look forward to working together as a committee to help guide our country's small business owners through these unprecedented times. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statement and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. And if there is no further business before the committee, we are adjourned. Thank you.